This 12-year-old boy just stopped a racist cop. You won't believe what happens next. It was a regular afternoon at a local coffee shop on the busy streets of New York City. The sounds of clinking cups and chatter filled the air, with a few customers lost in their phones, others engaged in quiet conversations. But today, something was about to change. Inside, a middle-aged police officer, known for his short temper and tough demeanor, stood at the counter, waiting for his coffee. His jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the room, as if daring anyone to cross him. Unbeknownst to him, the woman behind him, the one he'd ignored completely, was no ordinary customer. She was the new police chief, having just been assigned to the precinct, though no one in the coffee shop knew that. Behind the officer stood a 12-year-old boy, his arms folded as he quietly observed the officer. The boy's eyes were sharp, his posture defensive, like someone who'd seen enough injustice to know when to act. The officer had noticed him earlier, scowling as the boy stood a little too close, like he didn't belong. "Hey kid, back off," the officer growled, his voice filled with authority. The boy stood still, his eyes never leaving the officer. But just as the officer turned to grab his cup of coffee, he felt a hand on his arm, firm and unyielding. The boy had somehow managed to get closer, and now his hand was gripping the officer's wrist, stopping him from taking the coffee. "What do you think you're doing?" The officer spat, his face twisted with anger. He raised the coffee cup as if threatening to pour it over the boy's head, but in the heat of the moment the coffee splashed everywhere, on the boy, on the officer, and on the floor. The boy didn't flinch. Instead, he pushed back, his small hands forcing the officer's arm down. "What the hell?" the officer shouted, his face redder now with fury. He took a step forward, his hand going for the boy's collar, but before he could grab him, the woman, calm, unflinching, stepped in between them, her badge visible for the first time. The officer froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. He didn't recognize her at first, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. She was someone to be reckoned with. The coffee shop went silent. The boy stood firm, his eyes locked on the officer as the officer's face turned a deeper shade of red, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The steaming coffee dripped from his uniform, staining his badge. But it wasn't the coffee that had his attention now. It was the woman who had stepped between them. She was taller than most, with an air of quiet power. Her suit was perfectly pressed, and the badge gleaming on her chest seemed to shine brighter under the dim lights. As the officer glanced down at her badge, his eyes narrowed, slowly processing the realization. You're the new chief, aren't you?" he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with both disbelief and contempt. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "That's right," she said calmly, her voice steady as she met his gaze with a look that could melt steel. "And I don't tolerate behavior like that." The officer's grip tightened on his coffee cup as his gaze shifted to the boy, still standing unwaveringly in front of her. "Who the hell do you think you are, kid?" he growled, his tone sharp. The boy didn't answer. He simply held his ground, his small frame defying the officer's intimidation. "You don't belong here," the officer spat, taking a step closer. "This is my turf." The woman stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the officer's shoulder, guiding him back a step. "No, officer, this is our turf, and you just violated every code I stand for." The officer looked around, his chest heaving with barely controlled rage, but no one in the coffee shop dared speak. The patrons were frozen, their eyes darting from the officer to the woman, trying to piece together the weight of the confrontation unfolding before them. "Listen," the officer barked, his voice rising. "I don't take orders from—" "I wasn't giving you orders," the woman interrupted, her eyes cold and steady. "I was telling you what happens when you cross the line. You should have learned that by now." The boy, still silent, looked up at the officer, a sense of calm determination in his gaze. The officer, now visibly shaken, could feel the truth of the woman's words sinking in. "You're lucky this kid stepped in," she said, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "But I'm not going to let you get away with this. Not today." Not on my watch. As the officer opened his mouth to respond, the boy spoke up for the first time, his voice low but firm. You don't get to hurt people just because you think you can. The officer's fists clenched, and for a moment, it looked like he might lash out. But something in the woman's stance, in the boy's unwavering confidence, caused him to pause. He knew something was different now. He didn't realize it yet. But this wasn't just any confrontation. This was the beginning of something bigger. A reckoning was coming, and the officer could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The room was thick with tension, the air so heavy it felt like it might crush them all. The officer's face twisted in confusion and simmering fury. He stood, glaring at the boy and the woman, trying to regain control over the situation that was slipping from his grasp. You don't know who you're messing with, the officer hissed, his voice low and threatening. He took a step back, trying to reclaim his space, his fingers twitching around the handle of his now empty coffee cup. But the woman's unflinching gaze was like a vice around him, and the boy's cold defiance only served to fuel his anger. The woman, however, remained composed. I think you should leave now, she said quietly. The calm in her voice contrasted sharply with the officer's escalating temper, and it seemed to grate on him. I'm not going anywhere, lady, the officer snapped, his fists clenching. Not until I've set this right. His eyes darted between the boy and the woman, his gaze wild. You don't intimidate me. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. No one has to intimidate you, she said. But you're going to learn something today, officer. Something you've clearly missed. Before the officer could respond, the boy, who had been standing silently beside her, spoke again. You're nothing but a bully with a badge. And we're not afraid of you. That hit hard. The officer's fists clenched tighter, but this time there was something in his eyes, something that bordered on uncertainty. He was a cop, a man who'd made his living on intimidation, but the kid's words dug into him like a thorn, unsettling him in a way he couldn't quite explain. I said leave, the woman repeated, this time with a bit more force behind her words. The officer took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually turn around and walk out, his anger spent. But just as he turned toward the door, he paused. You think you can just walk away, don't you? He muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. His mind raced, the words of the boy echoing in his head. It was clear to him now. This wasn't just a child who had stepped up. This wasn't just some rookie cop he could intimidate. There was something else here. Something more dangerous, more powerful. The woman wasn't just the new chief. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she wasn't going to let him get away with his actions. The officer turned back to face her, his eyes narrowing, a sneer crossing his face. You're not going to win this, he said, trying to force conviction into his words, but it was too late. The reckoning had already begun. The woman took a step closer, her eyes hard. You already lost the moment you decided to pick on a child. You should have known better, but now you're going to face the consequences. Suddenly, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside the coffee shop filled the air. It was a police car, a marked unit. The door slammed open and two officers stepped out. One of them a familiar face, the woman's partner, and the other a younger officer with an air of determination. The boy's eyes widened as the officer who had just arrived locked eyes with the woman. The scene was about to take a turn. The officer who had caused the trouble didn't notice it yet, but the weight of the situation had changed in an instant. You've been reported, the new officer said coldly, his eyes scanning the situation. The officer's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected reinforcements. He hadn't expected the chain of events to unravel like this. And in that moment he realized the consequences were much closer than he thought. As the new officers moved in to take control, the woman's voice cut through the tension like a knife. You've got one chance to leave with some dignity. Don't make this harder on yourself. The officer stood frozen, but deep down he knew it was over. His time was up. The officer's chest tightened as the reality of his situation hit him. The moment the new officer stepped inside, everything had changed. The power he thought he wielded had evaporated, and in its place, there was nothing but the undeniable truth that he had made a grave mistake. "Put your hands where I can see them," the younger officer ordered, his tone sharp and unwavering. The officer's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, but a glance from the woman, cold, calculated, was enough to freeze him in place. She wasn't giving him any room for hesitation. The officer's pulse quickened. The last thing he'd expected today was to have the tables turned on him, especially not by a child and a woman who he'd thought was just another bureaucrat in a suit. He sneered, but it was weak, a last desperate attempt to hold on to some semblance of control. "I didn't do anything wrong," the officer muttered, trying to defend himself. His voice trembled slightly, betraying his fear. "You don't know what it's like out there on the streets. You don't understand the pressure." The woman's gaze was unwavering. "You abused your power, officer," she said, her voice even but firm. "And you thought you could get away with it, but today it ends." The younger officer stepped forward, his expression stoic as he handcuffed the officer. The older officer didn't resist, but there was a flicker of anger in his eyes, anger at himself for letting things go this far. He had thought he was untouchable, but now the reality of his downfall was crushing him. The boy, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, stood a few feet away, watching as the officer was escorted out of the coffee shop. The young officer who had arrived turned to him, giving him a small nod of respect. "You did the right thing, kid," he said, his voice warm but serious. The boy didn't respond, but the small glimmer of pride in his eyes was enough. He had done what was right, and for once he felt like he had made a difference. As the officers left, the woman turned to face the remaining customers. The coffee shop had returned to its quiet buzz, the tension dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. She stood tall, her badge gleaming in the dim light, a silent symbol of authority and justice. She turned back to the boy. "You were brave today," she said softly. "But remember, sometimes standing up for what's right isn't easy." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know," he said quietly, "but I couldn't just stand by and let him hurt people." The woman smiled, a rare expression of approval on her face. "I think you're going to do great things." The boy didn't speak, but there was a new sense of confidence in his stance. As the woman turned to leave, her footsteps steady and purposeful, the boy lingered in the doorway of the coffee shop. The bustling world outside seemed a little less chaotic, a little more hopeful, as if one small act of bravery could change everything. The officer's fall wasn't just the end of one man's career. It was a message. It was a reminder that no one was above the law, no matter their badge or power. And as the boy watched the police car drive away, he knew this was just the beginning. The coffee shop had returned to its usual hum. The clink of spoons and cups, the low murmur of conversations, and the whir of the espresso machine filled the air once again. But something was different now. The atmosphere had shifted, like a quiet storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of calm, but one that was tinged with purpose. The boy stood by the window, watching as the police car carrying the disgraced officer drove away. His gaze was unwavering, and though his hands were stuffed into his pockets, his posture was straighter than it had been when he first walked in. He had done something today, something that had mattered. But more than that, he had proven something to himself. As the door of the coffee shop swung open, the woman, the new police chief, stepped back in, her heels clicking against the floor. She glanced around, meeting the eyes of the few remaining patrons. A subtle nod from her was all it took to bring the room back to its normal pace. The tension had broken, but her presence lingered like a shield, steady and unyielding. The boy turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken question. "You did well," she said with a small approving smile. "You showed courage when most would have stood back and done nothing. That's rare." The boy shrugged, his voice small but firm. "I didn't think. I just knew it was wrong." The woman's smile softened. "And that's why you were right." She stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder in a rare moment of warmth. "The world needs more people like you." More people willing to do what's right no matter the cost. The boy didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew, deep down, that this moment, this act of standing up against injustice, was, only the beginning. There would be more battles ahead, more wrongs to right, but he was ready. The woman looked toward the door as if considering the next steps in her own journey. "I've got work to do, but I think you've earned a break." She gave him a small, approving nod before turning toward the exit. As she walked out, the boy watched her leave, then turned back to the window. The city outside seemed the same as always, busy, chaotic, unaware of the quiet victories taking place within its walls. But for the boy, everything had changed. He had stood up to injustice, and in doing so, he had found something far more important than any victory, a sense of purpose. The officer might have fallen, but what really mattered wasn't the fall. It was the message that had been sent. No one, no matter how powerful, could escape accountability. The change had already begun, and the boy knew that it would ripple outward, touching more lives than he could ever imagine. As the boy turned and left the coffee shop, his steps felt lighter, more certain. The world had shown him its flaws, but he now knew that he had the power to help fix them. And in the quiet streets of New York, a new kind of justice was taking root, one small act of bravery at a time.